Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the less advertised hobbies of the Middle Ages, stealing art. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the 9th century, the city of Venice had a problem. Not a military problem, not a financial problem, a branding problem. Venice was growing wealthy from trade and slowly becoming one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean. Ships were arriving from all over the world. Merchants were making fortunes. The city's influence was expanding every year. But there was one thing Venice lacked: a really impressive saint. Now, in medieval Europe, saints were not just religious figures, they were marketing tools. If your city possessed the relics of a famous saint, pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to see them. Pilgrims brought donations. Donations brought money. And money built very nice cathedrals. In other words, saints attracted traffic. Rome had St. Peter. Compostela had St. James. Other cities proudly displayed relics of martyrs, apostles, and holy figures whose bones were believed to perform miracles. Venice had a lagoon and a lot of ambition. So, the Venetians decided to solve the problem the same way ambitious cities often do. They would acquire a saint, preferably a famous one, and preferably without asking too many awkward questions. Their target became Saint Mark the Evangelist, one of the authors of the Christian Gospels. According to tradition, Mark had died centuries earlier in Alexandria, Egypt, where his body rested in a local church, which meant the relic technically belonged to Alexandria, but technically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In the year 828, two Venetian merchants named Buo de Malamocchio and Rustico de Toello arrived in Alexandria. Officially, they were there to trade goods. Unofficially, they were there to steal a saint. According to medieval chronicles, the merchants located Mark's tomb and secretly removed the body with the help of sympathetic local Christians. Now they faced a practical problem: getting a dead evangelist past port inspectors. Their solution was clever and extremely medieval. They hid the body in a basket and covered it with slabs of pork. Muslim officials supervising the harbor considered pork unclean and avoided inspecting it closely, which meant the cargo passed through the port without much attention. Inside that suspiciously pig-themed shipment was one of Christianity's most important saints. The merchant sailed back to Venice, where the relic was welcomed with enormous celebration. St. Mark immediately became the city's patron saint. The magnificent Basilica of St. Mark was eventually built to house the stolen remains, and the famous winged lion of St. Mark became Venice's symbol, which means that today, the entire identity of Venice is partly based on a 9th century smuggling operation. History remembers it as devotion, but if we are being honest, it was also an extremely successful heist. If the Venetians proved that saints could be smuggled across the Mediterranean, the monks of medieval France proved something else. You do not always need speed to steal a relic. Sometimes patience works better. In the early Middle Ages, monasteries across Europe competed fiercely for relics. Owning the bones of a famous saint was essentially the medieval equivalent of owning a world-famous museum exhibit. Pilgrims traveled great distances to visit holy relics. Pilgrims brought offerings. Offerings brought money. And money kept monasteries running. So naturally, some monasteries looked at neighboring churches and thought a dangerous thought that relic would look much better here. One of the most famous examples involved the relics of Saint Faith, known in French as Sua. Her remains were kept in the town of Ajan, where she was already attracting pilgrims. But another monastery located in Conquer had a problem. They had no major relic, which meant fewer pilgrims, fewer donations, and fewer reasons for travelers to visit their remote monastery. So, the monks of Conquest devised a plan that was both brilliant and slightly ridiculous. They would steal the saint. But instead of sneaking in during the night, they decided to take a more subtle approach. They sent one of their monks to Anne. His mission was simple: join the rival monastery, blend in, wait. The monk arrived in Agen and did exactly that. He became part of the community. He prayed with the other monks. He worked alongside them. Day after day, year after year, he lived peacefully among the people he planned to rob. And he waited. Not for weeks, not for months, for 10 years. 10 years of patience. 10 years of pretending to be completely trustworthy. Finally, when the opportunity came, the monk quietly removed the relics of Saint Faith and returned to Conquest. Mission accomplished. When the relics arrived, the monastery celebrated. Soon word spread that Saint Faith now rested in Conquest. Pilgrims began arriving in large numbers, bringing donations and attention. The monastery built a magnificent golden reliquary statue to house the relics, and Conquest became one of the most important pilgrimage stops along the road to Santiago. The monks justified the theft with a simple argument. Clearly, Saint Faith wanted to live there, which is a surprisingly convenient explanation for stealing a saint after waiting a full decade. If Venice proved saints could be smuggled, and the monks of Conquers proved they could be stolen with patience, the sailors of southern Italy demonstrated something else entirely. Sometimes you can simply walk in and take them. In the 11th century, the relics of Saint Nicholas rested in the city of Myra, located in what is now modern Turkey. Nicholas had been a 4th century bishop, famous for generosity and miracles. Over time, he became one of the most beloved saints in Christianity. Yes, the same Saint Nicholas who would eventually evolve into Santa Claus, which means that medieval sailors once carried out a kidnapping involving the historical origin of Santa. History is strange. By the year 1087, the political situation in the region had become unstable. Turkish forces controlled much of the surrounding territory, and Italian cities feared that Christian relics might fall into the wrong hands. This created a convenient justification. Sailors from the Italian port city of Bari decided the safest place for St. Nicholas's remains was Bari. Naturally, a group of merchants and sailors sailed across the Mediterranean to Myra with a very specific objective. When they arrived at the church holding the saint's tomb, they did not exactly behave like respectful pilgrims. Instead, they forced their way inside. According to contemporary accounts, the sailors confronted the monks guarding the relics and demanded access to the tomb. The monks protested, which is understandable when strangers arrive and announce they intend to remove your saint. The sailors were not particularly interested in negotiation. They broke open the tomb of Saint Nicholas and removed the bones. To their credit, they did leave a small portion behind, which in medieval relic economics counted as generosity. The bones were transported back to Bari, where the city greeted them with enormous celebration. A grand basilica was built to house the relics, and Bari instantly became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Europe. Pilgrims arrived from across the continent to visit the saint. Donations poured in. The city prospered, and St. Nicholas officially relocated to Italy. The sailors justified the theft by claiming they had rescued the relics from possible destruction, which may be true, but it also happened to make their hometown dramatically richer. A happy coincidence, apparently. If medieval monks and merchants approached art theft with careful planning, patience, and elaborate justifications, the Vikings had a different strategy. They called it show up with axes. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raiders from Scandinavia began attacking monasteries and coastal towns across Europe. Their first raid took place in the year 793 at the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. For the monks living there, it was a disaster. For Viking raiders, it was excellent shopping. Monasteries were some of the richest places in medieval Europe. Over centuries, monks had collected beautifully crafted religious objects, golden chalices, silver reliquaries, jeweled crosses, decorated gospel books, and elaborately illuminated manuscripts. These were masterpieces of medieval art, but the Vikings were not particularly interested in their artistic value. They were interested in the gold, and monasteries had a lot of gold. When Viking ships appeared on the horizon, monks often had little time to prepare. Raiders stormed ashore, looted churches, and carried away anything valuable. Precious metal objects were melted down. Jewels were removed from reliquaries. Even decorative elements from churches could be stripped and reused. To the Vikings, these treasures were not sacred. They were portable wealth. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes survived only because the Vikings did not consider them valuable enough to bother with. Gold, silver, and gemstones were far more attractive prizes than pages of carefully written Latin, which is one of the few moments in history where the lack of interest in literature accidentally helped preserve literature. Some raids also involved relics. Monasteries housing famous saints were prime targets since their reliques. Unfortunately for the Byzantine, it was also extremely tempting. In April of 124, Crusader forces breached the walls of Constantinople and entered the city. What followed was one of the most famous acts of looting in medieval history. For 3 days, Crusaders stripped churches, palaces, and monasteries of their treasures. Golden icons were removed from altars. Precious manuscripts disappeared from libraries. Relics were taken from shrines. Bronze statues were torn down from public monuments. The scale of the theft was enormous. Entire wagon loads of art and treasure were transported back to Western Europe. Cathedrals and churches across France, Italy, and Germany suddenly acquired magnificent Byzantine relics and artworks. Some of them remain there today. One of the most famous examples is the set of 4 bronze horses that once decorated Constantinople's Hippodromium. Venetian crusaders carried them back to Venice, where they were placed above St. Mark's Basilica. They still stand there today, which means those horses have been successfully stolen for more than 800 years. The sack of Constantinople shocked the Christian world. A Crusader army had looted one of Christianity's greatest cities. But for medieval collectors of sacred art, the result was clear. Across Europe, churches suddenly possessed treasures that had once belonged to the Byzantine Empire. The largest art heist of the Middle Ages had been completed, and it was carried out by an entire army. By the High Middle Ages, relic theft had become so common that monasteries developed a surprisingly creative excuse. They claimed the saint wanted to be stolen. This explanation was known as furtum sacrum, or holy theft, and it appeared again and again in medieval chronicles. Whenever a monastery acquired relics from another church under suspicious circumstances, a miracle story conveniently followed. The saint apparently had requested relocation, and one of the most famous examples involved the relics of Saint Foy, also called Saint Faith. Her relics were originally kept in the town of Agen in southern France, where she was already a respected martyr and pilgrimage figure. Pilgrims visited her shrine, bringing gifts and offerings to the church. which meant the Church of Agent had something very valuable. But nearby stood the Monastery of Conquest, located in a more remote region. The monks there faced a practical problem. Without a famous relic, very few pilgrims traveled to their monastery, and without pilgrims, no donations. The monks decided the situation required a miracle. Specifically, the miracle of Saint Foy deciding she preferred a different address. As we saw earlier, a monk from Conquest infiltrated the monastery and spent 10 years gaining the trust of the community. After a decade of patient waiting, he removed the relics and brought them back to Conquest. Now came the important part. The monks needed to explain why stealing a saint was not actually stealing. So they told pilgrims that Saint Foy herself had chosen to move. According to the story, the saint had grown unhappy in Aachen and wished to reside in Conquest instead. The monk who stole the relics was merely carrying out her divine wishes. A convenient interpretation, but the strategy worked remarkably well. Once the relics arrived, Conques quickly became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval France. Pilgrims traveling the famous route to Santiago de Compostela stopped there to visit the shrine of Saint Foy. The monastery even built an extraordinary Riri statue to house the relics. Covered in gold, jewels, and ancient gemstones donated by pilgrims, it remains one of the most remarkable works of medieval art. In the end, the monastery prospered, and the story of Saint Foy's miraculous relocation became part of medieval legend, which suggests that sometimes miracles in the Middle Ages looked suspiciously like very successful theft. Not every medieval art heist involved sneaking into a monastery at night. Sometimes the theft looked a lot more official, and one of the most famous examples involved the crown of thorns, believed by medieval Christians to be the crown placed on Jesus during the crucifixion. By the early Middle Ages, this relic was kept in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city possessed an enormous collection of sacred relics, many associated with the life of Christ. Owning such relics gave Constantinople tremendous religious prestige. But prestige does not always pay the bills. By the 13th century, the Byzantine Empire was struggling financially after years of war and political instability. The Latin rulers who controlled Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade were deeply in debt. And when rulers are deeply in debt, they sometimes start selling things, even extremely holy things. In the year 1238, the crown of thorns was temporarily pawned to Venetian merchants as collateral for a large loan. Venice now held one of the most sacred relics in Christitas. Of course, they insisted they were protecting the saint from Viking raiders, which was probably true, but the result was still the same. A priceless relic moved from one place to another, and the city that received it became famous. History sometimes calls this preservation, but from a distance it looks suspiciously like very careful theft. Among the countless treasures stolen during the sack of Constantinople in 124, one particular artwork stood out: 4 enormous bronze horses. They once stood atop the Hippodromium of Constantinople, the vast stadium where chariot races and imperial ceremonies took place. These horses were not ordinary statues. They were ancient masterpieces believed to date back to classical Greek or early Roman times. In other words, they were already extremely old when medieval crusaders arrived. For centuries, the statues had symbolized the grandeur of the Byzantine capital. Visitors entering the Hippodromium saw them towering above the crowds, shining in the sunlight and representing the wealth and prestige of the empire, which naturally made them irresistible targets during the looting. When Crusader armies captured the city, Venetian forces in particular took a strong interest in the horses. Venice had played a major role in transporting crusaders across the Mediterranean, and its leaders were determined to leave Constantinople with something impressive. Stealing 4 massive bronze sculptures certainly qualified. Removing the statues was not a simple task. Each horse weighed several tons, and transporting them across the sea required careful planning. But the Venetians were experienced merchants and shipbuilders. If they could move spices, silk, and armies across the Mediterranean, they could move 4 horses. Eventually, the statues were shipped to Venice. Once they arrived, the horses were installed above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica, where they immediately became one of the city's most recognizable symbols. Visitors to Venice could now admire artworks that had once belonged to one of the greatest cities in the world, and they have remained there ever since. Well, mostly. In the 19th century, Napoleon briefly removed the horses and transported them to Paris after conquering Venice. They were eventually returned, proving that even stolen artworks can sometimes be stolen again. Today, the original statues are kept inside the basilica for protection, while replicas stand outside overlooking St. Mark's Square. But their story still carries a hint of medieval drama. Because these famous horses traveled from Constantinople to Venice, not through careful cultural exchange, but through one of the most successful art thefts in medieval history. By the later Middle Ages, relic theft had become so common that it quietly created something unexpected: a relic economy. Churches, monasteries, and rulers all wanted sacred relics. Owning the bones of a saint, a fragment of holy cloth, or even a small object associated with a martyr could attract pilgrims from across Europe, and pilgrims meant money. The result was predictable. Demand exploded. Supply, however, was limited. There were only so many saints to go around, and most of them had already been buried somewhere inconveniently loyal to their original church. So, relics began to move. Sometimes they were stolen, as we have seen. Sometimes they were quietly relocated during wars. Sometimes rulers gifted relics to friendly cities, and sometimes they were sold. Yes, medieval Europe developed something very close to a relic black market. Merchants, travelers, and even clergy occasionally transported relics across borders, offering them to churches willing to pay. Some of these relics were genuine. Others were optimistic interpretations. By the 13th century, the number of relics circulating across Europe had grown dramatically. Churches proudly displayed fragments of the true cross, bones of apostles, and pieces of saints' clothing. Occasionally, the math became questionable. Several churches claimed to possess the head of the same saint. Others displayed multiple arms, legs, or ribs belonging to a person who had clearly not possessed that many limbs. Medieval scholars noticed the problem. The theologian John Calvin later joked that if all the claimed fragments of the true cross were assembled, they could build an entire ship. Despite the skepticism, relics remained enormously valuable. Pilgrimage shrines attracted thousands of visitors every year. Entire towns prospered because travelers came to see sacred objects, which meant the incentive to acquire relics remained extremely strong. Sometimes this involved negotiation, sometimes it involved diplomacy, and sometimes it involved quietly removing a saint from a rival monastery and pretending it had always belonged to you. By the late Middle Ages, relics had become one of the most unusual forms of cultural currency in Europe, and the line between devotion, commerce, and theft had become